Among the most valued and endangered of our colleagues are writers who think lucidly about art and publish in newspapers. Usually they're called art critics, but their purview is much broader. By writing about the lives and practices of artists, as well as reviewing exhibitions, they ponder the complexity of human society and our contributions to it. Kenneth Baker has been the resident art critic for the San Francisco Chronicle since 1985, and he was also a contributing editor to Artforum from 1985 to 1992. He's taught at Brown and Stanford universities, as well as closer to home at the California College of Art. His most recent book is The Lightning Field, published by Yale University Press. Now, this is a very personal, poetic meditation about one of the most important artworks of the last century. It's an artwork with which Kenneth has had a long, intimate relationship with for many years. And this qualifies him uniquely to introduce and converse with the Swiss-born, New York-based multimedia artist Ugo Rondinone. Now, the reason for that will become clear over the course of the presentation and slightly thereafter. Kenneth Baker.
Thank you, Bill, and Joanne, and David, and the institution as a whole for staging this wonderful event, because it has been quite spellbinding so far, but all that stops with me. So this title is something of a placeholder, and so I disavow it in a sense, but maybe you'll find some reason that it might apply after you hear my remarks. I'm going to look at a work of land art, from my point of view, the work of land art from the 1970s, and then something from 2013 that, to me, I think answers to the demands on land art now in a non-land art form. So I'm going to start for context with this. Remember this? For us of a certain age, it's impossible to overstate the impact that images such as this had when they were first made public. This is from NASA's website. It's from the Apollo missions of 1969. And it was one of the first images to show us the Earth whole. And this had a tremendous impact on the thinking of artists, and not only of artists, but of everyone, really. There was a tremendous spur to ecological action, to defense of the planet, from being able to see it or feel as if we were seeing it whole and as an object, placing it in a sense imaginatively within reach, like things we handle, like this. It looks handleable. And I haven't heard anyone really make mention of this. I guess David did a little bit ago, David Brooks, and Mark Wilson this morning commented on the speed with which this culture domesticates powerful images and objects and experiences. And images such as this of the whole Earth were, in the manner of our culture, banalized and trivialized and sentimentalized immediately and relentlessly, appearing on everything from teacups to t-shirts and beach balls, to the point where its impact as a spur to imagination and the sense of privilege that we had at that time, 1969, and being among the first people ever to see the world whole, and as a whole, that was completely frittered away. And with it went lots of things. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail on this. The point is that it's very difficult to hang on to something that is a source of leverage, as this was in its day, to defend those leverage points from sentimentalization, from corruption by popular culture. Now, this type of image, we all know there are many of them, was also a spur to artists. And the land art movement, such as it was in those days, was in part a response to this kind of new consciousness of our place and its limits, our place in the universe, our place on a planet. And just to continue, before we move on to land art per se, the sense of how this movement away, this movement towards the vertical, because it really was about rising from the earth to a point where no one really stands or could stand. Now, these were manned missions, the Apollo missions to the moon. This might have been taken by a human, this picture, I'm not sure. NASA's website is a little vague on that point. But certainly, even before this image was made, others like it were being taken by mechanical means and have been ever since. I mean, they're being taken of us every moment, all the time now, by satellites that have been circulating for a couple of generations already. We all know we're under surveillance all the time, and this happens to be an early image of total surveillance, even though it's not a very refined one in the sense that no detail of our lives is represented here. But we were all, not all of us, but many of us were in this picture to one degree or another. I don't see anyone waving, but we all knew, we all felt included, we who were there to feel the impact of these images when they were new, felt included in a way that we are not included or don't feel included in an image such as this. Now this is an image taken in July 2013, according to NASA, and it was taken by the Cassini space explorer, which is way out beyond Saturn now, and it was beyond Saturn when this was taken. That's more than 10 times the distance of Earth from the sun. So the Earth is in this picture too, they claim. There's a tiny point of light, which from my vantage point I can't even see in this image right now. But it's, there was I can tell you roughly where it is, because I'm told we have a laser pointer handy, or we might. Someone recognizes it. Actually, there's many parts of the solar system are involved in this. Okay, red button. Oh yeah, here we are. It's over here. Maybe you can't see it. Unless the slide is reversed, unless this image is reversed, that is not us. That's something else. Because we are over here. So anyway, as I say, this reduces us to a point of light in this image, invisible. And of course, this was not taken by a human. This is taken by a machine. And it represents, I'm just reading a book by James Nesbitt, a new book about land art, whose title I can't remember because it makes the book sound utterly deadly, but just not. It's a really interesting book. And he refers to this as one of the latest expressions of the mechanization of the sensorium, that is to say, exporting our sensory capabilities to a distance where they no longer have any connection to us whatsoever. So the second thing to say about this, and this has something to do with what Mark Wilson was commenting on earlier today, is that the transparency of this image and of the image of the Earth from the moon that I just showed, that transparency is an illusion. It's actually an ideological illusion. It's a very loaded transparency in its falseness, because it's part of what that transparency is veiling is the militaristic impulse behind this kind of exploration. Now, that's not our problem most of the time. However, we find ourselves forced to be concerned with the fate of the Earth, whether we like it or not. And that force of conscience, that pressure of conscience, was felt back in 1969 as well. And it was responded to by artists of various temperaments. And one of the greatest was Walter Di Maria. So here we come to the lightning field. How many of you have been to the lightning field? Okay. That's a goodly proportion. For those of you who can't see out in the atrium, quite a few hands went up. Well, I don't have to dwell too much on the technical specs, but for those of you who haven't been, I will tell you this is an installation on the land, on high desert plain, where the land elevation varies by less than 10 feet over a mile by kilometer area. The span of the piece is a grid, a mile by kilometer in size. We have 400 stainless steel poles, each of which comes to a needle-sharp point at the tip. And they vary, their tips form a level plane at the top, parallel to sea level. So their lengths vary according to where they stand on the site. Now, if you go there by day, midday, it's almost invisible because it responds to the angle of sunlight, as you can see in this late afternoon image. Now, these pictures were taken by a human, me, because I was working on this book project for many years. I was allowed to take as many pictures as I wanted to. How they control that process now, if they can even control it, I don't know. I suspect they ask you to surrender your mobile devices, but I don't know. They used to ask you to surrender your camera when you went there as a visitor. Now, I suspect images are uncontrollable. But here's what happens as the sun starts to decline, is the poles, which are made of stainless steel, are actually stainless steel mirrors. They begin to glow with greater and greater intensity until at sunset, they are blazing. They are the brightest things there, by far the brightest things you see in this environment, if it's a clear horizon. If it's not, you'll have something else to see. And there's a particular thought about where we are in history or where we were then. I believe we're still there. This is a Cold War artifact, so it's a Cold War thought. But it's a thought that's still living in our minds, mostly unconsciously, but it should be there. Walter used to say, isolation is the essence of land art. And when you went there in the 70s, when this picture was taken, right after the piece was made, it was 35 miles from the nearest paved road, which is nothing compared to the isolation that David Brooks puts himself in. But back then, it was coming directly from Manhattan to a place 35 miles from the nearest paved road was a shocking experience of deprivation. And essentially, these objects replaced the world you left behind. So your first question was, to what extent do these objects represent the world I left behind? And it turns out that they were so thoughtfully contrived, so beautifully made, and precisely placed that they represent very well a world ruled by technology and the thinking of technology, and especially a world determined to see technology to the end of the road, wherever that is. And one of the ends of the road, certainly it was on our minds in the Cold War years, was nuclear holocaust, nuclear destruction. Now, we've all been told since 1989, the Cold War is over, we can all relax. Well, that's a lie. I mean, the Cold War may be over, but nuclear fear is not, or it shouldn't be, because most of the weapons that were in place in a standoff in the Cold War are still there. They're still active, and they're still, between Russia and the US, on launch on warning status, which means in 20 minutes, it could all go to hell. So who wants to face this? None of us, including me. But I found it an inescapable thought when I was in this kind of isolation. And I think DeMaria intended that. I think he wanted you to, in this kind of isolation, to ask yourself, suppose the world ended, how would I know? How would the information reach me here? So he has a positive response to this. The work contains a resolution of the problem it presents. The problem it presents is, how do I bear the consciousness of history that I bring with me here, that follows me here in my own mind? Traditionally, or not traditionally perhaps, but in the modern context, a sense of beauty the beauty of the world is in confrontation with a sense of one's historical position, the historical reality we find ourselves living in. To look at one is to look away from the other. And again, if you have a sense of your historical position, you will feel a pressure of conscience. What could I do? Today, this takes the form of an ecological question, of environmental activism. What can I do to slow, to stop, to reverse the earth being cooked by the processes of human culture and their consequences? In this time, and I think really still, if we face facts, it's the other question, the more immediate question: what can I do to stop the destruction of the world by this insane weaponry, which once unleashed will be uncontrollable? It'll be uncontrollable because the human impulses to use it will be uncontrollable. Now, the answer, DiMaria's answer, is shown to you by your planetary position. The sun intensifies the beauty of this place and these objects to an extent that it becomes overwhelming as your sense of historical position is, if you think about it. And one used to require the denial of the other. To indulge yourself in the beauty of the world seemed to require denying the reality of your historical position. DiMaria found a way with these objects and this installation in this site and the way it behaves in relation to the sun. He found a way to merge these, to make beauty the only conscionable escape. The total confrontation and acceptance of the beauty of the world, the reality of things as we see them, is the only acceptable refuge from historical awareness. So those two aspects of experience are perfectly merged in this work in a way that you can really only believe is true if you have experienced it yourself. Just one more image of how it changes from time of day to time of day and with weather conditions and so on. This is dusk on a slightly hazier day than before. It begins to take on the colors of the light. It has no color of its own, the lightning field objects themselves. And what you're seeing here is only about 10 or 15% of the number of objects that are there. So it's vastly prolix. It's a really extraordinary work. And one of the ironies behind it is that it was funded partly by profits from the Schlumberger Corporation, which was then and still is one of the major oil field operations suppliers and implementers in the world. That sort of confrontation didn't bother DiMaria because he was comfortable with contradiction. This is a single pole after sunset on a given night. You might see this, you might not, depending on what the weather conditions are like, the time of year, and so on. What happens here is that as the light goes from the horizon, the light will rise up to the tip of this pole, and all you'll have is what looks like a candle flame in space at the end, and then that goes very suddenly. And you realize that these are, in a sense, mirrors of individuals, human individuals, and that they present you with the view that your appearance here on Earth is just a matter of shining and flaring for a moment, whatever that means in your particular mission in the world, and then vanishing. So it's a very confrontational work, and yet it's utterly passive. It does nothing. It's as inert as art can be, but it presents you with a situation which is unforgettable and becomes a tool for thinking about your place in life, in the world, and in history from then on. Now I'm going to show you one last piece. It's a 2.5-minute excerpt from a work by a sound artist named Bill Fontana, whom many of you probably know. He doesn't consider it a work of land art, but I do, in the sense that I think what's needed now, and I'm showing these first images as a result, as a way of implying that the vertical perspective and vertical distance from our situation has gone way, way further than it is useful to thinking about what we must do, might do, and so on. We need to get horizontal again. We need to think about what kinds of beings we are in order to make any kind of headway in our sense of how to position ourselves. So this is an excerpt of Bill Fontana's Acoustical Visions of the Golden Gate Bridge. I could watch this. I'll convey your applause to Bill. I could watch this all day long. For me, it raises the basic question, is this trip really necessary? Because what you're seeing, this was shot across and underneath the expansion joint of the Golden Gate Bridge. There's a catwalk underneath there. And he just set the camera there, and it's live sound. It was a recorded live sound. It's a 40-minute piece altogether. And again, it asks us to expand our imaginations horizontally. What's out there? What's the periphery that we're ignoring? And where is this stuff going, and where's it coming from? And what's our responsibility in relation to it? And the confinement of this viewpoint is itself an important feature of this demand that we reorient our imagination when we're trying to think about what to do. How should we comport ourselves in what we realize to be a very difficult situation? When you think about what's going on in that image, shipping, auto traffic, weather, sunlight, fog, there's a lot happening, and yet we see only the evidence of it, and the traces, some acoustical, some visual, and so much of what we confront in the way of what Timothy Morton calls hyperobjects. By the way, if you don't know the book Hyperobjects, Art and Ecology After the End of the World, it's worth reading. Although it's rhetorically overheated, it's a very important concept. And the notion being that hyperobjects are things that affect us in ways in which we only perceive traces. But we know that those traces are powerful, dangerous, and they have to be reckoned with somehow. And something of that spirit is in Bill Fontana's piece as well. Now, this is in no sense a précis to, except that it precedes Ugo's presentation. The reason for that is that there was a hinge in terms of a desert project, which is now in abeyance for the moment. And nonetheless, we are proceeding as planned, me first and then Ugo. So